Ethan Carter could feel the river before he saw it. The smell of cold water and wet stone rose up the path as dusk pulled the city's light into thin bands. He tightened his daughter's mitten and kept his head low against the wind. Maya's small hand fit in his like a reason to keep going, no matter where they had to go that night. Maya's wristband caught a slant of amber from a street lamp and blinked like a tiny promise. It was a hospital band, simple plastic, the kind that read a name and a not-quite-forgotten instruction. Ethan rubbed the faint raised letters with his thumb as they walked. The band was both shield and scar, a reminder that some things required constant attention, that life could tilt in a breath and demand care you couldn't always pay for. He had been making do for months. Shelters, day jobs, a friend's couch when there was one. He never let Maya see the worn seam at the heel of his boot. He never let her go hungry. They were nearly home, such as it was, when the woman at the railing turned her face to the river. She wore a coat cut like a ruler and boots that had known polished marble, not gravel. Her hair was damp, but she didn't seem to notice the rain that had started. Ethan remembered noticing details in his old life too. People leave clues the way rivers leave silt. The woman moved as if she belonged to a calendar of meetings and flights, but the way she stood gave everything away. She was a person shrinking against a world that was too loud. "Do you think she's okay?" Maya asked without the trembling parent's caution. The child had a brightness that trimmed through the worst nights. She asked the kind of question that required an answer free of fear. Ethan watched her grip the railing, saw the weight of the moment tilt through a human body. For a second, the city seemed to hold its breath. A pigeon shook itself and startled, and the woman lost her footing. She didn't scream. The sound of the river swallowed it. No one thought, at least not before action, about the cost of a human life that slides between rocks and current. Ethan thought of his wife, Sarah, and the day the ambulance lights went blue behind their house, and the small voice that had once been a chorus of bedtime stories. He thought of the sleepless nights in hospital chairs and forms that asked for numbers he didn't have. Those memories had trained him to move. He shouldn't even have been running. He had mud in the soles of his shoes, a sleeping bag folded against his shoulders, and a daughter whose heart made a rhythm that demanded discipline. But action is a language learned by those who have loved someone through illness. It translates fear into motion. He dropped Maya's mitten into her palm, unhooked his hood, and pushed through the crowd of scattered umbrellas. The rain slapped his face like hands trying to pull him back. He heard a woman on the path shout something, "Call someone!" or "Stop!" And he didn't care. When he reached the railing, the woman's coat was already half over her shoulders, water taking the stiff fabric. Her hands clawed at the iron like someone who knew the concept of leverage and had just been told there would be none. Ethan reached past a slick thumb of steel, and he saw close up the look in her face. It was not fear, not exactly. It was fatigue made of very old grief. He took off his shoes at the lip of the river and dove. The water hit like a memory, cold and immediate. It closed over his head with a sound that could strip focus clean. He kicked and fought the current the way he had once fought cramps in a hospital hall at 3 a.m. Methodical, angry, utterly committed. He found her by instinct and panic. Her fingers tangled in at his sleeve like someone grabbing at a rope. Underwater, the world was compressed into a few essential things: air, direction, the absolute imperative to get someone to the surface. He pulled the woman under his arm and pushed up. A mouthful of river flashed at him, bitter and cold. A spray of rain and panic followed. He hauled her against the bank, every muscle burned, and when his boots finally scraped real ground, he lay on the river's edge and coughed until his ribs felt raw. She was lighter than he expected. He thought of that, absurd and immediate, how some people are feathered by privilege in ways that shield them from heavy weather, until the weather strips that shield away. "Help! Somebody, please!" a voice cried from behind him. Hands reached down. A man in a jacket grabbed the woman's shoulders and dragged her up the bank. Ethan stayed where he was, chest heaving, rain washing the taste of river out of him. Maya's small figure knelt at his side, mittens forgotten, her eyes large and sure. "You okay?" she asked. Ethan managed a half laugh and a nod. "I will be." The woman coughed and opened her eyes. For a long moment they simply looked at one another, two strangers meeting at the bottom of a small catastrophe. Her lashes were rimed with river water. Her pupils were tiny and hard. She smelled like the scent of expensive things trying to outshine the river's honesty. Lena Whitmore, she managed, fingers searching the air for a name like an anchor. Ethan, he said. He told her his name because names are a line back to being someone's story, not a statistic on a form. Ethan Carter. This is my daughter, Maya. Her gaze slid to the child and registered something like shame and something like gratitude. Thank you, she said. Her voice was formal and then small, like a machine whose battery had finally run too low to keep its outer casing warm. An ambulance arrived in a flurry of blue lights and efficient hands. They wrapped the woman in a foil blanket, tucked gauze underneath wet hair, and slid her onto a stretcher. What happened next moved in bureaucratic increments, questions from EMTs, an exchanged name, a check to see if she had allergies. Lena's suit jacket was removed, folded into neat lines, and someone pressed a paper cup of water into Ethan's hand. He had done this before, the sudden detachment of a world whose members are coded in different shades of privileged urgency. He watched as Lena's mobile phone was handed to a paramedic. A number was called. A name was spoken in clipped corporate tones. The lights of the ambulance threw the river into a moving silver ribbon. Do you need us to come with you? The paramedic asked. It was a practice protocol to offer, a courtesy that implied choice. Ethan looked back at Maya. The child's hand found his thumb and squeezed. He shook his head. The shelter's check-in would close. There were curfews and rules. It was complicated being two people alone in the world. It was complicated in a way that didn't make news. When the ambulance doors shut and the engines hummed, Lena reached out, hand trembling, and pressed something into Ethan's palm. White paper with heavy black letters. A business card. Lena Whitmore, CEO. Her wristband had been ripped in the tumble, exposing a pale line of skin and a faint old scar that crossed her palm like a faint city map. I'll make sure you're okay, she said. It was not a promise in the swift currency of the transient, but it had weight behind it. An intention matched to influence. He barely believed her. People with power promised a lot of things to little men like Ethan Carter, but she looked as if she might actually mean it. Maya, who had been quiet and steady through the chaos, tilted her head and said something that made both the paramedic and the woman on the stretcher laugh softly despite themselves. Did you drown because you were sad? She asked. It was not rude. It was a child's straight question about cause and consequence. Lena's fingers fumbled for a tissue and then laughed in a way that was thin as paper but honest. Something like that, she said. The ambulance took Lena away with a polite wave and the rain folded back into itself. People drifted along the river walk, talking about umbrellas and appointments, and life reclaimed its small economies. Ethan walked Maya back toward the shelter, their shoes leaving muddy prints that would be washed away by the morning. After the first night, the video cameras arrived like a second wave, less dramatic, more insinuating. But that was later. Right then, the city swallowed the emergency like it had swallowed a long list of other emergencies that were not, in most people's calculus, their problem to solve. They slept that night in the shelter's quiet cavern of curtained beds. Maya slept with her wristband still on, as if the band itself could be a talisman against storms. Ethan lay awake for a long time listening to the shuffling breaths of people who had become temporarily a family of circumstance. He thought of Sarah, of a life that had been steadier once. The memory was both balm and barbed wire. He allowed himself to think for a while that he had done the right thing, that some measure of rightness still existed. The next morning, the city delivered a thin, intrusive light. Ethan left Maya with breakfast and went to find work. The day labor gatekeeper hesitated when he saw Ethan's hands. They were clean but calloused, and then waved him through. The work was hard and sweaty and paid in cash. He spent the morning lifting steel beams and setting anchors for a facade that would look immaculate at a distance. The shame of being paid by the hour and then disappearing to a shelter at night was something he swallowed like dust. He had nearly forgotten the card in his back pocket until the afternoon when the world's habit of residual kindness nudged him. He sat on a stoop, sweat cooling on his neck, and unfolded the card. Lena Whitmore, CEO. On the back was a number and a note in neat script. Thank you. Please let me know if you need immediate help. He thought about throwing it away. He thought about how many times someone had promised him a kindness that later evaporated. He had been let down so often that it became an instinct. Trust less. But trust is a muscle too, and sometimes it needs to be used or it withers. He texted because a paper card in a pocket seemed absurdly small. He typed, "Hello. This is Ethan Carter. You saved my daughter and me last night. Thank you." There was a heartbeat of nothing, and then, "I'm glad you're okay. Can we meet?" Ethan nearly put the phone down. The offer could be an entanglement. It could be a lie. It could be a headline. In the shelter there were rules about who could visit, and there were people who would take no part in crossing a line between worlds. He imagined a camera's glare and a headline about a CEO buying her own good conscience. But Maya came into the room with a stack of crayons in her small fist and a solemnity that made him thin out his fear. "Can she have cookies?" she asked. "For being saved?" Ethan looked at her and then at his phone. He texted back, "When?" He added, "Quiet place. No cameras." She answered almost immediately, the punctuation brisk and exact. "This afternoon. A cafe near the river. I'll be there at 3. Ethan kept his appointment because sometimes choices are smaller than courage. He borrowed clean clothes from a shelter donation bin, shirt neat, coat zipped. He trimmed the hair at his own fingers with a pocket knife until it looked like an approximation of neat. He thought briefly of how the world measured upstandingness by the cut of someone's collar. When he arrived at the cafe, his palms smelled faintly of concrete and coffee they didn't serve for free. People talked about spreadsheets and children and weather in that way people in cities do. A mosaic of small things meant to drown the truly big ones. He spotted Lena before she saw him. She sat at a table by the window, hands folded over a cup she wasn't drinking. She had taken off the suit jacket and looked for the first time to his eye like someone who was learning how to be less guarded. Maya, at his side, walked in as if she owned the place. She held his hand like an artifact to protect. She had an art project in the works, an enormous crayon drawing that she wanted everyone to admire, so she climbed into the booth and placed it like a banner. "You make big art," Lena said, as a woman noticing the honest thing to notice. "Not yet," Maya said, "but I will." The child's certainty was a small lighthouse. They ordered the most modest thing on the menu, which was a pastry for Maya and water for Ethan. Lena refused to let Ethan pay. He watched her hand the server a card with the same brisk handwriting, and then saw her fold forward with a fatigue that reached into her shoulders. They took slow steps into conversation. Lena talked in measured sentences at first, offering gaps where the other person could place an answer. Ethan spoke in shorter lines, practical and somewhat wary. Maya punctuated their talk with questions that were sharp as flint. "Why did you jump?" she asked at one point, gaze unblinking. Lena's eyes filled with a kind of rusty light. She had scars along one forearm that showed when she brushed back her hair. "Because something in my head said it was the only way to stop the noise," she said. Her voice was an even surface over a torrent. Ethan listened. He spoke about Sarah in fragments, an inhaled name here, a laugh remembered there. He did not speak of everything. Grief is a thing people are careful with, like a delicate instrument that must not be dropped. There was a point in the conversation when Lena reached across the table and folded her fingers around Maya's small hand. It was an act out of rhythm for a woman who had built her life around schedules and deliverables. Maya did not flinch. She accepted the clasp with the same trust she accepted a parent's breath. "You said you'd help us," Ethan said quietly. He was not asking for charity. He wanted a person to mean something. Lena inhaled in a way that rearranged her face. "I meant it," she said. "I can arrange for some things. Medical follow-ups, at least. I have resources, but more than that, I want to make sure you're safe." "You can do that with money," Ethan said. "There's beds we can get, appointments we can keep. It's not..." He stopped because he did not want to sound small, and he did not want to sound like he expected to be sold. Money helps, Lena agreed. But you saved me. I can't measure that in a credit memo. You're not a line item in my life, Ethan. The name moved like a small warmth against his skin. She said it as if she hoped to make it real. They did not resolve everything then. There were tentacles of publicity that hadn't yet tightened, and there was the practical nod of where they would sleep tonight. Lena offered to call someone who could find them a longer-term shelter placement. She offered to have an intake scheduled for Maya with a pediatric cardiologist the next week. She wrote down a number on a napkin that read like a promise. My assistant, Naomi. Call. I'll check. Ethan kept the napkin like he kept the business card in his pocket. Both were talismans against the ordinary erosion of hope. He left the cafe with a sense of having been seen, which is different from being helped. Being seen was a currency he had learned to hoard. On the walk back to the shelter, the city seemed to move in layers. Lena's world was all glass and policy memos and people who expected emotion to be packaged and scheduled. Ethan's world was a line outside a shelter, the sound of night folding itself into breathing, the watchful tiny body of a child who needed him to be everything. That night as they ate an improvised dinner under the safety of a donated blanket, Maya asked the kind of question a 7-year-old asks when the world has been rearranged in the space of a day. Do you think she will come back? Maya asked, eyes wide, crayons forgotten. Ethan paused. He thought of how often people who promise disappear when the visible drama cooled. He thought of the time Sarah had been in the hospital and a neighbor had said, "I'll be there," and then never showed. He also felt something new unfurling in his chest, a tentative belief that there were people who could carry more than they thought. I don't know, he said, but we'll be okay either way. Maya looked at him and nodded with the wisdom only children sometimes trade in. Okay, she said, but if she comes, she has to bring cookies. The next morning a message waited on Ethan's phone. Are you free to talk? There's something else I need to say. He brought Maya to a clinic where Dr. Patel, a steady-handed pediatric cardiologist, checked her over and scheduled the follow-ups Lena had offered. Dr. Patel's voice was a professional steadiness that did not pretend miracles. We'll monitor her, he said. There are options and we will make them work. Ethan's gratitude to Lena was complicated, part relief, part suspicion. It's ever so easy to be indebted to a stranger. The city thrives on such invisible economies. He sat in the clinic chair after Maya's appointment and typed a response. Maybe later. He meant the maybe as a protection around his hope. Lena's reply arrived in a flurry of short sentences. She wanted to be transparent about the publicity. She asked if they would speak in a place without cameras. She apologized in advance for anything the attention might do to them. Ethan read the message, thumb hovering over the keys. He felt the old reflex to hide. He also felt something else, a seed of faith that had not yet grown a root. He agreed to meet because the alternative was to keep his daughter in a system that prioritized forms over people. He agreed also because he knew what grief looked like on both sides. The woman's eyes in the river had reflected his own. That afternoon, Lena arrived at the clinic carrying a folder and a look that was both exhausted and genuine. She had removed the outer armor of boardrooms and worn the soft sweater of someone trying to be less rigid. There were visible lines at the corners of her eyes like small valleys carved by tears. Ethan, she said, and there was a heat in her voice that had nothing to do with money. I'm sorry about the publicity. I can't control everything. You don't have to control everything, he said. You just have to be honest. She laughed, a small involuntary noise like something admitted out of relief. I can do honest, she said. I want to learn how. They sat together in the clinic's plastic chairs and talked. Lena said things she hadn't said in public, about how the world she ran often felt hollow, about how decisions had been made in boardrooms that never looked like the messy human things they touched. She spoke of regret like a heavy weight she was not sure she deserved to put down. You saved me in ways you don't know, she told Ethan. You yanked me back from something dumb and ended. You made me see that I could stop pretending and start being scared in a way that wasn't terrible. Ethan did not know what to do with gratitude from a woman whose life had the power to reshape theirs. He had never had a person offer to be so present before. It was dangerous in its novelty. Outside, the rain had stopped and the river had an evenness to it. The current was a soft undercurrent, indifferent and steady. Inside, people moved. Nurses, families, the rustle of syringes and paper. The city turned its hourly gears. Lena's phone vibrated once, then thrice. She ignored it. She was trying, he noticed, to keep the hands on the wheel of whatever she had in her head. To be at the river had undone some steel. Why now? Ethan asked at one point. Why she had been on that railing at all. She folded her hands in her lap and looked at the floor like she was reading something in the grout. Because losing is fatiguing, she said. Because sometimes you feel like nothing you do matters and the only way to make the noise stop is to stop being here. And then you almost go through with it and someone you never met grabs you, grabs me, and makes you see that maybe there's someone who would miss you. Maya's hairline tilted forward and said, I would miss you. Lena smiled in a way that reached through the cynicism in her eyes. You'd miss me? Yes, Maya said. You have crayons inside your belly. Everyone in the room laughed because the child had a singular sense of metaphor. Lena's voice slowed. It's ridiculous, she said. I have everything, and I felt like a ghost. Then someone pushed me into the river and I saw clear as day that the thing I wanted was someone I could be real with, someone who would know me if I was ugly. Ethan's jaw tightened. You can't fix everything with gestures. I'm not trying to fix everything with gestures, Lena said. Her hands trembled. She wrapped them around her cup like it was ballast. But action is part of the apology for how I've lived, and I don't want to keep living a life that scares me. She looked at Ethan like a person who had arrived at an abrupt clarity. I want you and I want Maya. If you'll let me try, I want to protect you both. It was a line one might expect in a novel, the kind of speech that demands a reaction and offers a cliff as its consequence. Ethan felt the air leave him and then press back in. He thought of Sarah's favorite sweater on the top of a laundry basket that never truly smelled like her again. He thought about shelter curfews and hospital forms labeled with blank spaces for parents' signatures. He thought about the cost of trust and the cost of guardedness. I can offer some things, Lena continued, softer now. Housing support, medical appointments, privacy. I will be honest with my board and step back if I have to. I will take the heat. I can't promise you a fairy tale, but I can promise to be here. Ethan's mouth tasted like salt and iron. That's a big promise, he said. She nodded. I know. That's the part I keep thinking about. People like me, most of the time we think relationships are transactions. I don't want that. I want something hard. I don't want to run away from what scares me. Maya watched the exchange with an attention that unsettled and comforted him all at once. The child was old and blunt enough to see adult misdirection and wise enough to pick at it. You have a scar on your wrist, she said suddenly, from when you fell before. Lena looked at the thin white line and then back at Maya. Yes, she whispered. I have a whole lot of them. Maya nodded, as if this explained something deep in the universe. Scars are maps of having been through things and not being finished. Ethan felt the world fold into a simpler geometry. A child, a man, a woman with scars meeting over a river that had almost taken one of them. They did not become a family that afternoon. No grand arrangements were signed and no promises that could bind in a court were offered. But there was a new alignment, a small constellation forming of people deciding they might walk toward one another instead of away. Lena left a number again, but this time she left it along with a commitment to help with an intake at a clinic, to speak softly with reporters she could reach, and to set up an appointment with a pediatric specialist in a week. She wrote it in pencil and underlined the word privacy. Ethan kept the pencil mark like a litmus. When he walked back to the shelter holding Maya's mitten, he felt for the first time in months that he had been handed a tool that might carve out a better day. But the city is a place that tests the edges of generosity. He had a sleeve full of smallness, the need for work, the need for rest, The paperwork for assistance that always had one more box to tick. That night, a buzz of chatter crept through the shelter like static as someone muttered that they had seen a story online. A string of posts had started to spread. A woman, a CEO, a river, a homeless man who jumped in. There were angles in the posts, cheap optimism, moralizing pity, a celebrity lens that tried to frame heroism as a one-off and not the labor of human devotion. Ethan tried not to think of the cameras. He tried not to think of the way headlines flatten people into roles that do them violence. He had his history with headlines. Small-town papers had once written about Sarah and a fund drive and how a local family coped. He knew the sharpness of a narrative that demanded you be grateful and poor for the rest of your life. He slept poorly, the mattress thin and the night punctuated by coughs and the distant echo of life in other people's rooms. Maya slept with her small hand curled into his, her breathing steady and small. He counted her breaths like an inventory he could not afford to lose. In the morning there came a quiet knock at the shelter's office door. Naomi, Lena's assistant, efficient and dry, stood on the threshold with a clipboard and the kind of eyes that scanned for logistics. "We have a space for you at a transitional housing program," she said. The words landed not as charity but as the mechanics of relief, something to file into a spreadsheet that would, if it worked, push the family across a line. "It's temporary," Naomi said, "but it will give you time." Ethan's throat tightened. He had known the name of such programs, but he had never been offered one by a person who had the power to make a phone call and get a slot pushed through the system without a wait. He thought of the times he had stood in lines and of the forms that asked for pay stubs he couldn't produce for reasons nobody except him and the person who had left were privy to. "Do you want it?" Naomi asked, holding out a paper with a stamped endorsement. Ethan looked at Maya, who had the steady, unbelievable faith of a child who believed the world could reshape itself. He looked at the paper and then at the thick envelope in Naomi's hand, with logistics and the small print. He remembered the river, the way water had felt like a threat and a baptism at once. "Yes," he said. They took the room, a small apartment with a lock on the door, a kettle that made a polite whistle, and a window that looked out over a courtyard. It was not home yet, but it had the legal dignity of an address. For the first night in months, he slept without waking to the sound of other people's breathing, and Maya did not stir at the lined shank footsteps of late arrivals. The city kept moving. Lena returned to her office towers and to calendars and to the board. There were memos to draft, statements to refine, and people to placate. Ethan tried to remain distant from the machinery of her world, even as he accepted what it offered: appointments, a small housing subsidy, a promise of privacy. He recoiled at the thought of being paraded as a human interest boon to someone else's narrative. But it was warm and safer in the apartment, and Maya's laughter filled corners that had been hollow for too long. One afternoon, as he was sorting the heap of forms on the small kitchen table, a message blinked again on his phone. It was from Lena. "Can you come to the Riverwalk? I'm here." He looked at Maya, who was drawing on the floor, an enormous, vibrant rendition of the river, all currents and crayon foam. Her picture was labeled in block letters: Mama, Dad, Lena. Her handwriting was an honest geometry of hope. Ethan felt his chest seize with a cautious budding something. He called Naomi to confirm that there would be no press, no cameras, and then he bundled Maya into a coat and walked out toward the river, each step a negotiation with trust. When they arrived, Lena was at the railing again. She had shed the outer aspects of a CEO's armor, no jacket, hair pinned back loosely, and looked, in a way he hadn't seen before, like someone trying to learn what it meant to be ordinary. The river flowed as it always did. Indifferent, relentless, the same water that had nearly taken her and then returned her. She turned when she saw them and moved toward them with the purpose of a person who had rehearsed being honest and found the words rough on her tongue. She stopped a pace away, and for a heartbeat Ethan wondered if she would step back into her old life of polished speech and safe distance. Instead, she surprised them both. "I don't want to live like I have been," she said, voice low and steadier than the river. "I thought last night made things simple, but I was wrong. It made things urgent. Maya looked up at her and asked the question that had been sitting under so many of their conversations. "Are you going to be here?" Lena swallowed. The wind picked up around them, and the river reflected a pale, moving piece of sky. "I don't know how this will look," she said, "and I don't know what the board will say. I don't know how to make this not look like me buying absolution. But I know this. I want to be here for you. I want to try." Ethan watched her hands, which were not the hands of someone afraid of work, but the hands of someone who had not had to ask for help frequently. She reached into her coat, as if pulling something out of the moment itself, and for a second Ethan's muscles tensed, expecting a speech, a donation, a PR move. "I want to marry you," she said. The words landed like stones thrown into the river, their ripples wide and absurd and impossible to ignore. Ethan's first reaction was disbelief. Maya's mouth formed an O and then, with the frankness of children, turned into peals of laughter because proposals sounded like jokes in cartoon movies. Lena's face, in that hundredth of a second, showed a fracture between seriousness and fear. She had chosen a brutality of honesty instead of a safer, slower path. It was hours since the river had taken her. It was barely a day since they had met at the cafe. The city had not yet fully digested the story, not yet turned them into a neat narrative. Yet here, in the gray light, at the river that had nearly swallowed her, she made a choice that was so raw it hurt. Ethan did not know the right thing to say. He opened his mouth and closed it again. His life had taught him to measure words carefully, but the pull of the moment, so sudden and charged, made silence heavy as consequence. Lena rushed on as if explaining could make the daringness less like theft and more like truth. "I am not offering you money as a replacement for everything. I am offering myself, my life, my mistakes, my attempts. I will take the fallout. I will do what is necessary for Maya's care. I will be honest with the board. I will leave my job if I need to. I cannot promise that everything will be easy. I can promise that I will be here and that I will try to protect you both." Maya's small hand slipped into Ethan's with the impassivity of someone witnessing severe adult weather. Ethan felt the old war inside him, the part that wanted to guard the child from the unpredictable, the part that wanted to reach out and bloom into a possible joy. He looked at Lena fully now, the scar on her wrist, the tired lines, the earnestness blooming at the edges of her eyes, and he felt something begin to fracture open in him, a place where grief had calcified into bone. She had been in the river. She had seen the thinness of living alone. And here she was, offering a leap of a different kind. "Marry me," she had said. Words that were both an implosion and an offering. He had not expected to have to answer on the spot. No one had told him the rules. That sometimes life will ask for a yes before you have fully reordered your fear. He found himself moving in a slow orbit. A breath, a thought, a memory of Sarah's laugh and how long it had taken him to be alone in the dim parts of the house, and then thinking of Maya's wristband and how many times he had folded his life around her. He opened his mouth again. The river went on, indifferent to the scale of the decision placed upon its bank. The city hummed with small commitments, a taxi, a delivery, the beat of someone's headphones. People passed on the path, half aware, half unaware, of a life shift happening in the space between two bodies. Ethan's reply did not come as a cinematic, clean yes or no. It came as the honest, messy thing he knew how to speak. A request for time, for time, for a night to breathe, for a chance to answer without an audience. "Take the night," Lena said before he could finish. Her voice was steadier than he felt. "Come by tomorrow. Talk. Tell me what you need, Ethan. Tell me what Maya needs. I don't want you to say yes because you think I'll disappear otherwise." The air between them tasted like cold metal and possibility. People passed on the path, their conversations folding over the scene like a thin blanket that could be brushed aside at any moment. Maya, who had already learned how to hold enormous things inside a small chest, looked up at them and then down at her own hands. "Cookies," she said with absolute pragmatism. "Then maybe I'll decide." Lena laughed, and for a second the world narrowed to a shared breath. Ethan wanted desperately to make this clean, to hand her a list of conditions, and a calendar of appointments and a typed contract. Instead, He said what he always said when choices were bigger than his comfort. Okay. Tomorrow. They separated with the polite choreography of two people who had just agreed to begin something risky. Lena watched them leave, and then leaned on the railing until her hands ached in a way that felt like confession. She had made a vow on a raw edge and would have to carry whatever followed. For the first time in a long time, she felt the weight of that consequence settle in like a thing to be tended. If anyone had been watching closely, if someone had been overhead in a tree with a camera and a taste for headlines, the scene would have read like a beginning or an ending, depending on their appetite for tidy morality plays. The city, as it always did, furnished its own commentary in the next 24 hours. A handful of breathless posts, an op-ed that tried to make sense of the spectacle, a thread of commentators who argued about motives behind an act of rescue. Lena had resources to throw at the noise, and she threw them with the clumsy, sudden precision of someone still learning what help could look like when it was not a box on a ledger. Ethan and Maya went back to the apartment in transitional housing that Naomi had secured. It smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and something like hope. The place had 2 rooms, a real lock, and a kettle that shrieked on the stove like a small train. It was not a forever home, but it was the first place with an address in months, the first place where Maya could spread crayons on a table without someone telling them to pack up. That evening, Lena's message arrived. I'll come by after work. I want to see how you're doing. No cameras, please. He had promised to take a night, but sleep felt like something you earned, not a right. He lay awake with Maya's small breathing audible in the next room and thought about names and promises and the ways a person could mean something to another, without any paperwork to prove it. He thought about Sarah and the way she used to hum while she folded laundry. He thought about how grief had taught him both to act and to hide. The next day, Lena came, hands uncuffed from suits, and carried a box of cookies in a paper bag like an offering. Naomi hovered at the edges with a sensible face and a phone that had learned the rhythm of crisis. She left them alone for a while. Lena sat at the small table and watched Maya color until the child nodded off with a crayon still clamped like a tiny scepter. We'll deal with the cameras, Lena said once the small one was asleep, once the apartment had sunk into its gentle rhythms. I can keep reporters from the building. My team will file requests for privacy. I'll speak to HR. I'll tell them to leave you alone. Ethan watched her for a long time because watching had been one of his enduring skills, watching for signs of truth. You can do a lot, he said. But you can't stop everybody. There's always somebody. I know, she said, but I can make an effort. Her voice softened. And I will. I don't want you used as a prop. He told her what he needed in practical terms. A secure email contact for scheduling appointments, funds allocated quietly to cover medication copays and transportation, help with paperwork that made the system move faster for them, an advocate, a caseworker, somebody who would cut through bureaucracy because Lena could make a phone call and not be shuffled aside. He asked for privacy. He asked for Naomi to be present when something official happened. He asked that nothing be done without his consent. Lena agreed to everything he asked, and then she asked for something that was harder to sign on as a condition. She asked him to let her enter their lives slowly. I know how to sign contracts, she said. I don't always know how to be patient. I will try. He measured the words on her face. For someone used to drafting plans that could be measured in Q4 outcomes, this was a different ledger. He said finally, that's reasonable. Naomi stayed in the wings like a good stage manager. She arranged an intake with Dr. Patel, moved up an appointment with a cardiology nurse, and quietly negotiated with the housing coordinator at the program to ensure that nothing about Maya's care would be delayed by paperwork. The small kindnesses were functional and unglamorous, and to Ethan, they felt like actual lifelines. The first time Lena walked into the shelter office to speak to a manager about transfers, cameras followed. An enterprising local reporter had noticed her name popping across social feeds and thought there might be a story in the exile of the powerful. Naomi handled the journalist like a traffic controller, polite, firm, and non-committal. Lena gave a brief statement, careful and precise, no theatrics, no displays of contrition she did not mean. She said she would cooperate with any inquiries, and that she had offered support to the man who had pulled her from the river. Then she left with Naomi, shoulders set for a battle she had not expected to be public. At the company headquarters, the news arrived in a different register. Hushed conversations in glass elevators, a string of pointed questions from board members who measured risk in lines on spreadsheets. Marcus Chen, a board member whose face was as polished as his suit, watched the trading tickers with a thin patience. He liked predictability. He liked leaders who never surprised him. When the board convened, there were two objectives in the room: protect the enterprise and explain the image of vulnerability their CEO had suddenly presented. Lena's hands folded in front of her in a posture that was both deliberate and weary. She had not called for this meeting to ask permission for her life. She had called it because she planned to own what she could not justify away. Power has a language, and Lena intended, for once, to speak in plain, costly terms. "I will not be heroic in press releases," she told them plainly. "I fell. I needed help. I received it from a man named Ethan Carter." Her voice did not break, but it gathered. "I will talk to any journalist. I will answer questions for PR and for you. I will, if necessary, take a leave of absence. I will accept any consequences that result from my decisions, because this is not about the company's image. This is about my life, and about doing right by the people I harmed and the people who helped me when I could not help myself." There was a pause long enough for some of the board members to feel their blood pressure rise. Marcus sat very still, the kind of still that lives right before an attack. "Are you asking us to sacrifice operations for personal therapy?" he asked. "No," Lena said. "I am asking us to act like humans. There will be a plan. I will work with HR to ensure leadership continuity. I will not be reckless with fiduciary responsibility. But I will also not be dishonest about what made me this brittle." Some of the board members bristled. Some were relieved by the clarity. In the end, Lena proposed a partial step back, a reallocation of responsibilities that would allow her to be present for the cases she had ignited: medical appointments, privacy protections, and legal counsel to arrange for the family's stability. She offered to sign a binding agreement for reduced hours and oversight for a finite period, and to accept a review of her leadership metrics at the end of that contract. The board voted. The decision was messy and pragmatic. Lena would maintain her title but step into a less visible executive role for the next 3 months, while the company prepared a public statement crafted with honesty and caution. Marcus accepted the plan with the kind of concession that preserves his reputation without relinquishing his power. The media moved on and away in their rhythms. Some outlets applauded Lena's candor. Others sniffed around the edges for scandal. For Ethan and Maya, the noise was disruptive but not devastating. Reporters staked out places they frequented and tried to sketch a narrative that fit their appetites. The wealthy woman saved by the homeless man, the feel-good human interest thread. When a microphone was thrust toward Ethan one morning near the shelter door, a young, eager reporter with a notebook, he answered in the ways he'd been taught by hardship: short, true, and not theatrical. "I don't want to be in anyone's story," he said. "I want my daughter safe." Later, after the initial press had turned its attention elsewhere, Lena sat with a group of therapists who helped devise a plan for her therapy and for how she would be honest with her company. She began attending sessions with a counselor who specialized in trauma and leadership. On the first day, she walked in with the wary armor of a warrior, trying to learn gentleness. The therapist asked her small questions about shame and responsibility. She answered them with a clarity that felt like stepping into cold daylight. Not everything smoothed out. There were moments when Ethan's distrust flared: an unexpected press photo, a leaked memo, the whisper that a housing bed might be reassigned if someone with more immediate needs came through the door. Those moments were harsh and animal in him. He wanted to guard his daughter against spectacle even as he accepted offers. The trap of gratitude is a real and complicated thing. To accept what you need is not the same as to be bought. He kept that boundary in small iron filings, and Lena learned to respect the hardness in his edges. They built intimacy in small domestic increments. Lena showed up with coffee and an ability to unspool a screwy IKEA lamp. She learned how to make instant ramen taste like something close to care. She sat in a cheap plastic chair while Maya performed an epic concert of crayon drawings, and she clapped with an unpracticed warmth. The nights Lena stayed were awkward and sweet. She fumbled with blankets like someone learning a new language. Ethan watched her hands more than he watched her words, how they moved, how they tried to be useful without turning utility into patronage. There were errands and practicalities. Lena hired a social worker to help file for additional family assistance programs. She talked quietly with Dr. Patel's office to ensure Maya's appointments would be kept and costs managed. She set up an account to cover medication copays. She arranged for a caseworker to sit in on any meetings that felt burdensome, and she signed a privacy agreement that bound her and her assistants from talking to press about Ethan's past. Each piece of paper was a small scaffolding for trust. Month by month, things shifted in public measure and in private detail. Ethan found a steady job with a small renovation firm that liked his hand-eye precision and his unassuming reliability. He worked daylight hours. He came home at night with the smell of sawdust and the frayed edges of labor, and he slept with the new steadiness of someone who knew his feet were on more solid ground. The city still bore its indifference, but inside the little apartment, Maya's drawings pinned to the wall turned their corner into a gallery of claims. Then there was the test that made their commitments honest. Maya's follow-up test, an appointment that had been scheduled back when the storm was still fresh, showed a small but important change. Dr. Patel explained it in a room that smelled like antiseptic and the kind of focus that does not flinch. "It's not catastrophic," he said gently, "but it's a change that means we need to accelerate some interventions and monitor more frequently. We can manage it, but we'll need consistent care." Ethan heard the words in a state of spasmed clarity. He had always lived like every day might be a ledger where loss could be subtracted with a single mistake. Lena sat at his elbow, her calloused fingertips folded under her chin. The tiny changes in Maya's heart had a way of making every promise heavy as a stone. Lena's face tightened in a way that was familiar to Ethan, someone trying to carry the weight of a decision. "I'll be there," Lena said immediately. It was less a dramatic pledge and more a noticing of the shape of the problem. "Whatever it takes. Appointments, transport, time off. I'll drive her. You don't have to," Ethan started. He did not want to become the person who accepted charity in exchange for gratitude, but he also knew what it meant to have someone ride shotgun in the middle of a long night. "I do want to," Lena interrupted softly. "I want to be present." Maya, who sat on the exam table with her legs swinging, looked between them and then aimed a small, unblinking logic at them. "If you're in my life, you have to pass math," she said seriously. "We check numbers." Lena laughed in a way that sounded like an admission. "I'll start with sleep math," she said, "and then we'll work up to the calculus." There were nights that followed of small, sharp fear, trips to a clinic at odd hours when Maya's breathing felt off, a rushed conversation with a nurse, a quiet watch in a waiting room with vending machines that hummed like refrigerators of anxiety. Lena learned to be bedside in a way that could not be choreographed by PR teams. She sat with a hand on Maya's shoulder and learned the language of monitors and medications as if it were a craft. There were family meetings where Dr. Patel explained options with the professional calm of someone who had seen 100 hearts and the ways they could be coaxed into steadier rhythms. The world's criticism sharpened at times. A columnist suggested that Lena's involvement was more about salvation narratives than goodwill. A talk show host sniffed at the idea of a wealthy woman living with the poor. There were predators too, people who thought of the family as a headline and tried to leverage proximity for interviews and book deals. Lena and Ethan pushed back. Naomi received cease and desist letters and smoothed friction with the low heat of someone used to crowd control. The deeper challenge was internal. Lena's impulse to fix, to pay, to burn cash at problems collided with Ethan's need for autonomy and dignity. They fought about small things, about who would handle a bill, about whether Ethan should accept direct money from Lena's charity fund, about how to describe their relationship to caseworkers. Their quarrels were honest and sometimes ugly, but they were also where the scaffolding of a relationship got forged. They learned to put agreements in writing, to consult an attorney about guardianship paths and legal protections for Maya, and to set emotional boundaries, therapy for Lena, counseling for Ethan to work through survivor guilt and his fear of being beholden. Lena attended therapy sessions more consistently, and returning to the room where she had first spoken about the urge to step off the railing, she learned a vocabulary for her vulnerabilities. She spoke of how power had made her small in ways she hadn't predicted, the loneliness of being the person everyone expected to stand tall, the exhaustion of decisions where other people's lives were reduced to metrics. Her counselor gave her tools, mindfulness, grounding techniques, a plan to taper back work without vanishing. He suggested group sessions for executives who had experienced trauma. She attended them with the same curiosity she might approach a spreadsheet once she learned it could be human. Ethan, meanwhile, started meeting with a local support group for people who'd lost spouses and learned how not to be angry at the world so much. It was messy work. Sometimes a man at the table would cry about money. Sometimes someone would joke too loudly. Sometimes the silence would be a thing that felt like a bruise being pressed. He found small relief in that bearing of witness, that others had seen darkness and come back with a new set of hands. One afternoon, the board asked Lena to make a more formal statement at a press conference. She could have declined, but she chose instead to speak in public and in truth, a careful statement about mental health, the limits of leadership, and the need for transparency. She apologized without theatricality. She announced a plan for more resources for employee mental health, a fund for privacy protection, and a commitment to ensure that vulnerable individuals touched by the company's activities would be treated with dignity. The stock wavered that day, but there was also a conversation that had not been present before, a serious national thread about wealth, responsibility, and the human cost of productivity. It was not a fairy tale. There were setbacks. A scandal briefly raged when someone dug into Ethan's past and suggested he had been an opportunist. A few nasty comments reached the apartment's answering machine, people who could not reconcile generosity without suspicion. Ethan and Lena took steps to secure their privacy and to filter invitations. They were careful with what they allowed into their small household, and then, on an ordinary night that felt like it had been put together from smaller, true moments, something changed in the architecture of their lives. They had dinner, no cameras, no microphones, only the hum of the kettle and a table that a child had scuffed. Lena had learned how to fold a fitted sheet at Ethan's explicit request. Maya had set the table with a careful sense of ceremony. They ate pasta that tasted like an ordinary triumph. After dishes, Lena sat on the couch and Ethan on an overturned crate. Maya had fallen asleep cross-legged on the rug with a crayon under one ear. Lena put her hand on Ethan's forearm, an ordinary place, and he did not pull away. He let himself feel the small, steady insistence of presence. "I don't pretend to know the right way to go forward," Lena said, voice low. "But I mean what I said at the river. I want a life where being honest matters more than being polished. If you ever want out, you can tell me. I'll let you go without theatrics. But if you want in, I'm willing to do the hard work with you. I want a family that's chosen, not staged." Ethan looked at her, feeling the old armor of grief give at the seams. He had learned to make quiet allowances for the fact that nothing they did would erase the past. Sarah's absence would always be a room in his heart, and no new arrangement would make that room disappear. But he also knew that to refuse the possibility of a chosen family might be a different form of exile, one that would keep him and his child small in the face of a world that sometimes offered aid. "Let's keep doing this," he said finally. "Not a wedding for the cameras, not now, but I'll keep seeing if you mean it." Lena nodded. "I meant it at the river. I meant it then too. I'm asking for time to prove it." And so they did what most real people do when they want to test a life together. They put one foot in front of the other. They signed legal forms that clarified who could make medical decisions if needed. Lena arranged to have a legal team draft a guardianship pathway that could eventually lead to shared custody if everyone agreed. Small practical steps that were not fairy dust. They established financial arrangements that preserved Ethan's dignity. Lena's funds would be routed through a nonprofit caseworker who paid bills directly, arranged for housing stability, and provided employment support. Lena reduced her hours enough that she could attend appointments and be present for nights that felt heavy. Ethan found work that paid steady wages, and he took on classes that would help him parlay his construction skills into more stable employment. They made mistakes. There were fights that ended in slammed doors and reconciliations that began with apologies written in notes left on the fridge. Lena's board meetings sometimes pulled her back into a world where calculations mattered more than compassion. Ethan had nights when old anger came like a storm. But across the small increments of weeks and months, the scaffolding of their life gained a sturdier grain. The day Lena formally met with Dr. Patel to sign a standing order that would allow her to accompany Maya to appointments and to make immediate health choices if Ethan were unavailable, she arrived in jeans and a hoodie, and with a nervousness that made her hands small. Dr. Patel smiled. He had seen many faces shift when they were suddenly given permission to care without pretense. "We'll do this together," he said. "We'll set up a schedule and a monitoring plan that gives all of you the best shot. No promises about miracles, promises about consistency." Consistency became their currency. They marked appointments in a shared calendar, one that was analog and practical, post-it notes on the refrigerator, an online calendar where Naomi only posted necessary items and a list of things that counted as support. Food on the table, a night when Lena stayed until midnight, a day Ethan took off to be with Maya. By winter, the family had a pattern. Lena came by with hot chocolate after Dr. Patel's appointments. Naomi dropped off a box of groceries once a month. Ethan worked, earning paychecks he could count on. Maya's drawings proliferated like a flourishing of small flags. They attended therapy, Lena in individual sessions, Ethan in a grief group, and all three sometimes in family counseling where a therapist helped them learn to translate intention into action. And there was a moment, quiet and simple, where they crossed an ordinary threshold into something that felt like permanence. It was not a scene of rapturous declaration. It was a weeknight, snow soft on the window, a pot roast simmering, Maya asleep with a book on her chest. Lena had her hand on Ethan's shoulder. He turned and kissed her, a brief, honest press of mouths that tasted like the day's exhaustion and relief. It was not meant for cameras or cynics. It was meant for them. Months later, the three of them stood again at the riverwalk where the original incident had occurred. The water reflected a softer light. The city's sounds had an autumnal edge. Maya had a scarf around her neck and a new wristband that read her name in neat letters, a medical ID that Dr. Patel had insisted upon for peace of mind. Lena wore a sweater she'd bought on a market day, not a suit, her scar visible like a map she no longer hid. Ethan's coat bore the smell of the workshop and of a man who had learned to sleep with steady breath. They walked slowly. People looked but did not intrude. A few passers-by recognized Lena and offered quiet nods. The river moved along, indifferent and familiar, the kind of force that both takes and returns. They paused at the railing and watched a small tugboat make its slow way up the current. Maya swung her legs and asked for a cookie, which had by now become a family joke and an actual occasional treat. Lena laughed and produced a paper bag from her coat. Ethan took it and offered Maya one, the motion so ordinary it could have been 1,000 little acts of a life stitched together. "I didn't say yes the day of the river," Ethan said suddenly, looking at Lena. His voice had the texture of gratitude and caution, the same two strands that had run through their months together. "You asked me then, and it scared me, but you kept showing up." Lena's eyes caught the light and held it for a second. "That's all I wanted," she said. "To be allowed to show up, to be faultless only where it matters. Not perfect, just present." Maya polished her cookie off and announced, "Okay, you can stay." She had the bluntness of a child who wants the world to be predictable and kind. They stood there for a long time, the three of them breathing the river air, the city folding and refolding around them. They had not been absolved of pain. No narrative ending wipes clean the ledger of loss. But they had negotiated a new economy of care. Lena had resigned, not theatrically but matter-of-factly, from a direct line of power that had defined her for years. She had arranged for a transition period, for a replacement project manager, and for the company to fund more mental health resources. Ethan had built steady work and a plan to continue training. Maya's health had not been magically restored, but it was being managed with consistency, with a team behind it, and with two adults who had learned to be reliable in not spectacular ways. At the river's edge, Lena took Ethan's hand. It was not a wedding ring. They had not rushed into legal vows. But the hand felt like a covenant. "Maybe one day," she said. "If we ever want to make it legal, we'll do it where it matters. To us. But I'd like to keep choosing this." Ethan looked out at the water and then down at Maya's sleeping face, borderline and triumphant. He thought of Sarah and the life he carried in memory, and how both memory and the present could coexist without erasing one another. He thought of the way a body teaches bravery, one act at a time. "Choose me," he replied in the small language of a man who knew the weight of words. "I'll choose you back." They did not promise a perfect future, because none of them wanted the lie. They promised to be present, to continue with therapy, to keep the legal angles clear, to make housing permanent, and to protect Maya's privacy fiercely. That was the contract they signed night after night in the small domestic acts that make a life. Folding laundry, driving to appointments, sitting quietly during scans, making soup when someone was tired. On the way home, Lena walked a little ahead and turned back to throw her arm around Ethan's waist. He let her. Maya hummed a song she'd made up about rivers and cookies and safekeeping. The city breathed around them, and the river kept its patient, indifferent course. If any part of this could be distilled to a single truth, it would be this. Some rescues are physical, urgent, and immediate. Others are a slow, stubborn work of showing up when the cameras have gone and the headlines have cooled. The first saved a life from a river. The second saved the shape of a family from the hard ground of solitude and bureaucracy. Both mattered. If this story moved you, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Months later, there would be a quiet household where laughter was not a performance and where a child's sketch taped to a wall read, "Hours." Lena would spend mornings in a smaller office, working fewer hours, but with a new priority, people. Ethan would finish a certification for carpentry and hire on with a small firm that valued craftsmanship over speed. Maya would still have appointments, and Dr. Patel would still remind them there were no miracles, only steady tending. They would argue and make up and learn to apologize with fewer words and more actions. The river would continue to run, indifferent and true. And every so often, when the current shone a certain way, Lena would think of the throttle and the cold, and the way a hand reached for her without a thought for titles. Ethan would sometimes stand at the sink and think of the way he'd felt when Sarah still hummed, and both of them would carry those memories like rooms in a house they shared. They had not been saved by money, nor had they been fixed by vows spoken in haste. They had been slowly and insistently offered one another time, practical help, honesty, and the hard work of being present. On a riverbank that had once nearly claimed one life, 3 people now learned how to build something that could hold them when storms came again. Share this story if it reminded you that connection can change lives.